Thank you.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning here in the United States. Good afternoon to you in South Africa. This is Mark Anderson. I'm going to do a brief interview of today's topic. Our speaker is Dr. James Callegary. James has worked in Arizona and New Mexico, actually along the U.S.-Mexico border on a project now for some time. His, I think, real expertise is in geophysics. But I had requested that James speak about this topic because this is probably the premier example that we have in the United States of an effort or an attempt to manage a transboundary aquifer, which of course is what the South African or Southern African project is mainly about. So James has been working on this. I guess he can tell you it's been a few years now. I mean, I was involved with this project many years ago at its inception, but he's been doing the real work of negotiating, delivering the science and so forth to the partners in Mexico. So this is just an example, I think, probably the best example we have in the United States of an effort to jointly manage a transboundary aquifer. So with that, James, it's yours.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Can everyone hear me?
I can.
Okay. So one thing that excellent, thank you. One thing, Mark, I want to be sure of is timing. How much time do we have here?
Well, an hour has been allocated, but
okay.
Usually we leave some time, of course, for questions. Although historically we haven't had an avalanche of questions, but maybe today will be different. So I would say leave some time for questions.
Okay. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. Really appreciate you being here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, since it sounds like we have some challenges in common. As Mark mentioned, I've been working on this for some time, since 2007, and I will tell you about some of the experiences that we've had. So without further ado, let's talk about transboundary aquifers. So some of the challenges in general around the world, challenges of governance. So sharing resources and data are not always easy. There might be contention over that. How do we manage the water? Are countries in agreement about how to do that? There might be environmental and conservation issues associated with aquifers that are connected to rivers. There might be questions of equity. So who has access to this water? And then there are questions of climate time. So despite some of the challenges, between 1820 and 2007, over 680 water-related treaties have been signed. Those include both surface and groundwater. But without basic information, managing and water resource planning are difficult. So it's really critical to be aware of that collecting hydrologic information and other kinds, as I will explain later, is critical in order to successfully manage, in order to plan, in order to sign agreements. If you don't know what you're talking about, it's very difficult to plan for that. So continuing with some of the challenges. So transboundary aquifers are more than just an aquifer and a physical setting. There's policy, there's different legal frameworks. There are potentially disparities in resources, political, economic, and/or military resources. There might be institutional asymmetries. For example, in one country, the institution that regulates water may have different capabilities and different legal capacities than in the other country or countries. Also, power between countries. What is the history of the relationship between countries? Those are critical questions. And then finally, we have cultural and linguistic differences. So what are the cultures? Are they similar between the countries? Are they different? Are you using different languages? So one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that for us for me as a hydrologist, my training doesn't prepare me to deal with these conceptual and real complexities. Excuse me. So what are some solutions? So Peterson, Perlman, and Wolf came up with a list here that things at least need to start with respecting the autonomy of participating countries. That if we have participating countries, a diverse group of folks to make this work, we must consult our stakeholders. Who are the people who this is actually going to affect, and who are the people who have to make decisions about this? They have to be involved. And then another point that they made is that we must allow for each of the partner countries to take some responsibility for at least some of the project activities. So engagement, everyone needs to feel like they've got a stake in this. So setting, we have more than 360 transboundary aquifers that have been identified globally. That number can fluctuate. I can talk a little bit about that when we get to the US part. In 2008, the UN drafted some articles on the law of the transboundary aquifer. Some things that are in that document are equitable utilization of the resource, no significant harm by the country, and international and technical cooperation. The US actually have the legal framework, do the work that's required. And then there must be long-term and contingency planning because things won't necessarily stay the same. They emphasize the critical nature and assessment. So the work must be done together. Public participation, as was mentioned earlier, working towards transparency, ownership of decisions, and agreement and policies and management. Then the resource should be shared fairly. And if there are losses, there should be compensation for that loss. And then there has to be appropriate financing. If there isn't the financial backing to carry out the work, it just can't happen properly. So let's shift to the US-Mexico border region. Why is it important in our relationship with Mexico? So Mexico is the US's third largest trading partner. It's home to over 14 million people. You can see the region here along the border. And a tremendous amount of trade. There's over $500 billion. Portion of that crosses the border at the cities that are noted in the figure. So let's get some context here. I don't know exactly, so we'll have better figures hopefully in the next couple of years. In general, the US-Mexico border region is an arid environment. We have declining water tables due to a variety of reasons. We have contaminated aquifers. We have lack of sewage treatment in some Mexican cities. In large terms, to a large extent, aquifers are the sole or next available source of water. We have a complex binational bicultural environment with a long history between the two countries. And then we have improved upon this, but we still have inadequate knowledge in many areas of the quantity, quality, and movement of water. So groundwater resources in this area, because of that sole source, are critical for agriculture, industry, and municipalities. We do have river resources. We have the Colorado River and the Rio Grande River, but in many cases, those are inadequate to the need. Some of the impacts of sustainable use include salinity, spreading problems with salinity, and then chemical and metals contamination. And then we have some critical river flow and riparian corridors that are being affected negatively by water use. So some of our challenges in this area are the need for information and data sharing. We don't have accurate estimates of groundwater recharge or decline in most areas. We don't know the extent of contamination or salinity issues. We do have binational agreements. And I just want to pause for a moment here and say, in this first phase, I'm kind of giving you the whole context for what we're doing along the border. In the second half, I will focus a bit on our local area to talk about lessons learned. So some of these things will come up again. There's so much information that I figured it was a little bit of repetition is not going to be a bad thing. So we've got some binational agreements in place. We have a 1944 water treaty plus minutes. These minutes are modifications to the treaty, and those continue to be agreed upon between the two countries to add new requirements, or as new things become important with respect to water, new minutes can be implemented. For example, here we have minute 242, which established pumping limits in the area of the Wickle Phone and also in the Colorado River. We have the La Paz Agreement of 1983, which was agreed upon by the two countries, which was written to support integral environmental planning, to provide jurisdiction and establish a process for binational consultation. And then in 2009, most relevant to this topic, there was what's called a joint report establishing the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program. And I can talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So then again, I want to emphasize, actually, like many transboundary aquifers around the world, we have two, others may have more than two sets of institutions. We have different protocols for how we study water. We have different cultures and languages. For example, water in this area is governed federally in Mexico. It's a centralized governance, and it's governed by individual states in the United States. So just to give you some information about what is the program, this joint report of the principal engineers, we had agreement and a mechanism for binational transboundary studies. So prior to this, we had no intergovernmental mechanism for doing the work. Universities could do it, NGOs could do it, but the two governments couldn't act together without it. We have terms of reference, so how are we going to interact? So this allows for any transboundary aquifer along the border to be studied, but primarily we're focusing on this work on Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. There is interest there. So mechanisms within each country. So in the US, we have what's called the International Boundary and Water Commission. And that is a central organization. It's actually a binational organization, a part of the State Department of both countries. And there's one section for each country, and by law, by Mexican law, we have to work through them, and because of that, we work through them for our work. And that has actually really been useful in terms of providing one coordinating institution for both interactions, and agreements. So in the USGS, we have, or sorry, in the US side, we've got the USGS as the lead institution, but we also have the Water Resources Research Institutes, which are university-based. In Mexico, CONAGUA, which is the Mexican national, with other partners, they coordinate the work in Mexico. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about our investigations, our objectives are to use the binational agreement to study the aquifers. We want to understand what's the water budget, what's current groundwater recharge, where's contamination, what's in storage. We want to understand quantity and quality. And we want to think about what could be the impacts of further groundwater development. We need this information to be available to those who need to use it, decision makers, water managers, and the public. So we want these studies, when possible, to be binational studies. So we need to engage technical experts, have technical working groups to establish concerns and goals, and then we need to coordinate because there are lots of entities doing work along the border. So results to date, we had 4 priority aquifers established. We had 2, so here's Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California is over here. The Colorado River is along the border between California and Arizona, and the Rio Grande forms the border between Texas and the Mexican states of Chihuahua, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Tamaulipas. So at the outset, 4 priority aquifers were identified for reasons of population, et cetera. I'll go into some detail a little bit later. 2 in Arizona, the San Cruz and San Pedro, and then 2 in the El Paso area shared between New Mexico, Chihuahua, and Texas. Those are the Messier, Conejos, Médanos, which is in green over here, and then the Bolson. So in the Santa Cruz Aquifer, between Nogales, Arizona, and Sonora, we have been looking at water budgets and storage. We have various geophysical studies that have been carried out of the aquifer. There have been studies of water quality, including looking at some of the important riparian habitat and its health. And then we also have information on contaminant sources from mining, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, effluent discharge. So one of the things to know about the region here in Arizona is that this is a major mining belt, North American mining belt. So mining is always important for us, another factor that we have in common with you folks in South Africa. So in the San Pedro Aquifer, there's the Cananea copper mine, which is among the world's largest. There's the San Pedro River, which is an important conservation area and critical U.S. flyway for birds. We have published a binational baseline study. It's available in Spanish and English. And this has been a joint effort, not just of these government organizations, also of universities based in both sides of the border. In the Messier Conejos Médanos Aquifer, there has been a summary published by the Mexican Geological Survey. There's been information exchange between both countries. There have been geophysical and chemical investigations carried out by the USGS, and they've expanded their hydrogeologic framework, meaning a lot are expanding that with this work. Groundwater flow models have been published on both sides of the border, and the hope is to have a binational model. Continuing the current work, I just want to point out here, one of the current pieces is that we don't actually know how many aquifers there are. There is no officially agreed upon set of aquifers, so somewhere between 20 and 30. Line for what we think might be there, what's going on geologically that would constrain these aquifers and allow us to have a better understanding of how many there are and what their extents are. That work is ongoing. So currently we're developing protocols for rapid assessment and prioritization of transboundary aquifers. We're incorporating some simple groundwater modeling strategies and stakeholder engagement. Logically, we have a study that is going on in the Patagonia Mountains to understand what the impacts of mining have been there. In the Misia Conejos Medos and the Cruz Bolson, to continue to work on groundwater budget components, water quality issues, especially salinity issues, and then looking at in the Bolson fresh brackish water groundwater interfaces. Future work. So just so you know, I'm wrapping up this phase. So future work, looking at the regional scale. So we have this long 2,000-kilometer border. How can we develop consistent protocols for prioritizing assessments? We still need to establish binational technical working groups for these two aquifers. That has not occurred to date, and I'll give you some information on that. We have established them for the San Pedro and Santa Cruz aquifers. And we also need to look at establishing priority and goals for modeling the binational aquifers, and then develop baseline information for all the aquifers in the study area. Just to get back to why there haven't been binational technical working groups established yet, there are a variety of factors. I'll go into those in great detail, but some of them are out of folks' control. For instance, in Mexico, this past spring, CONAGUA, which is the lead organization for Mexico, they had a fire in their headquarters that burned several floors of their building, and so many folks back into their offices. So there's also a presidential election. So those kinds of things matter in terms of being able to make progress. Let's see. So we do have binational collaborative efforts. We have a collaboration. We're working on this binational report. We're slowly developing the basis for groundwater flow models. So they are working on getting these technical work groups going in these two aquifers over in New Mexico, Texas, and Chihuahua, and still in negotiations. We had a summit last April between folks who are working among folks that are working on groundwater in the whole region, and that included people from California as well. We just wanted to be able to get people together to talk about what the issues are, to meet one another, because that's critical for making progress, and to talk about what we're doing. And we have hopes to plan a Rio Grande Water Summit for 2020. So I wanted to take a moment here and talk about the Colorado River Delta, which is such a huge piece of both agriculture, trade, and water use between the US and Mexico. It's not officially part of our transboundary. Yes?
Sorry, can we take some questions before you move into a more specialized section?
Yeah.
Do you mind? Yeah.
Oh, no, that's fine. Yeah, go for it.
Thank you, everybody. I think we have a good audience today. Are there any questions on this general section that we've just had from James? I come from the transboundary natural resource management sectors. I find this absolutely fascinating to find many similarities between the kind of very slow processes that you've been going through to try and really just get just the policy, you know, the agreements in place so that you can start to work transboundary. And then you also face some other problems and other contingencies like fires breaking out. If there are any questions from the public, you can either use the raise your hand tool that you should see on your control panel, or use the question tool and just type your question in there and then I will pick it up. So let me see in the attendees if anybody is raising hands. Nobody is raising hands. I have a question, James, before you carry on. Can I ask?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Thank you. So you've spoken about the processes of getting here and how you are dealing with different governance systems for the aquifer basin.
Mm-hmm.
How is governance per se either a barrier? How has it been a barrier or an enabler in your state entity at the state level, whereas national government level? So how did you go around breaking that kind of governance barrier and make it work so that you can actually work on the ground together with the agencies that are responsible for the aquifer management on the ground?
Excellent question. Thank you. And a really critical question. We made some pretty big mistakes at first in trying to do this, again, because of both differences in history and especially internal to the US, very strong states' rights feelings. The states really were not very supportive of us working at the federal level on this, and really wanted us to work with Mexican individual states. And so those of us going into this did not have that institutional context when we began. And so we made the mistake of trying to initiate the work and conversation at the state level without going through either the International Boundary and Water Commission, the State Department of both countries, or in really connecting with CONAGUA. So when Mexico discovered that this project was being initiated, and realized that we had not been following the protocols required by their norms, they essentially shut the process down for a full year and said, we're not even sure we want to consult or work with you, so we'll get back to you. And about a year later, they came back and said, we are willing to work with you, and we would like to, but this is how we have to do it, and it's based in our legal framework. So it was a big difficulty that really delayed the onset of the project. Now we have a very well-established understanding of the protocol. We've laid that out really clearly. Work very well in general, but even still, as you noted, and as I mentioned earlier, things can happen. And I have to say that some of our initial mistakes, those mistakes continue to resonate today. So some of the difficulties in establishing new groups for these other aquifers still harken back to the clumsy way that we started the consultation. I can talk about even some other things that we did that were not well done. But in terms of institutions, that's kind of the best example.
Okay. Thank you very much for this. Just before, I see that Kevin has a question for you. So before I am your team, I just have a quick question. How many of you had to learn Spanish in order to work on this project?
Excellent question. It's critical to have at least a few individuals who are bilingual on both sides of the border. So there are definitely large parts of the folks who work on this who do not speak English or who do not speak Spanish. But those of us who are bilingual there has to be a core of people who have a variety of expertise. They have to have technical expertise in order to be able to carry out the work.
Thank you. Kevin, I'm going to unmute you now so you can ask your question. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah,
Sorry?
Kevin?
specifically, it's the issue of scale. In Africa and Southern Africa, we seem to have denoted a number of transboundary aquifers, but most of these aquifers are low productivity aquifers, and it seems to be based on rather the geology than hydraulic consideration. And I was wondering to what extent you consider scale in denoting transboundary aquifers, and then also the type of aquifers that you work with, whether you also work with low productivity aquifers.
Excellent question, and very important for how we are dealing with this. So we have a very large variety of geologic environments, everything from hard rock aquifers to aquifers that are, sediment filled. And some of them are high productivity, some are very low productivity. Typically, the ones that are considered the highest priority have been the ones that have been exploited the most because they have higher productivity and large storage. The aquifers, smaller aquifers, may have importance for environmental reasons, conservation reasons, but also tribal reasons. So we have certain tribes, some tribes, Native American, Native Mexican tribes that are binational. So the border actually cuts through their tribal lands. And we're only just beginning to talk about that because it's such a sensitive issue. So some of those tribal lands are based in locations where there are lower productivity aquifers. So that's something that we're moving towards discussions. The other places where we have low productivity aquifers that are important is in mining areas. There may be towns nearby to these mining areas, and we have this one ongoing study that I'll be presenting at the Geological Society of America next week. It's a fractured rock aquifer. The mines are pumping a fair amount of water, and local towns are very concerned about this. So that bumps up the level of priority simply because of that conjunction of potential conflict. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, James. We can carry on with the Colorado River and the second part of your presentation. I don't see any other questions. Oh, wait, there is a question from Patience. Let me have a look at it. Patience is asking, how does data exchange happen if in the basin, or so in the aquifers that you're looking at, if at all, and how is it managed?
So if I understand correctly, just understanding how do we carry out data exchange, and how do we manage the data?
Yes, please.
Okay. So data exchange, there's informal. So I do want to note that all along the border, there's some informal work that goes on, some informal communication that's not through this official platform. So there's where that kind of work is not being impeded. So which is useful because universities might want to work together and do binational studies, and they're free to do that. So there continues to be data generated even at these more informal levels. So we It really depends on the study area or the particular aquifer. If we have a binational technical program that's been developed, then we have a formal exchange of data that happens really at the outset of that project. So we don't get started really until we exchange some basic level of data, and typically that would be at a fairly high level what information is useful hydrologically, geologic maps, water level information, basic water quality data, maybe information on soils and vegetation, climate information. And that's just to sort of establish a good faith gesture that, yes, we're actually willing to share our official data between the countries. It's actually quite a big deal, that initial data exchange. Then in terms of data management, that is definitely evolving. I mentioned that for the Colorado River Delta. What we have right now is that the State Department agency that's between the two countries, the International Boundary and Water Commission, they're the official data repository for both countries for this work. So it was established that they're the ones where we will send our data. Unfortunately, at this time, they don't have a lot of capacity to manage the data and to serve the data. So we're looking for alternative ways to do that. We have a requirement in the USGS to publish all of our data. So we have a repository where we can publish them with metadata, et cetera. They're reviewed, but that's a unilateral type of data management. In the Colorado River Delta, which you see on the screen here, we're actively involved in developing a data management system that will allow us both in real time to collect the data and upload it into the data system. And then we're having pretty complex data sharing agreements because we have so many entities involved, some of whom want to keep their data private. So arriving in a more complex situation like the Colorado River Delta at an agreement on how to share and manage data has been a long and complicated process. So hopefully that gives you some feel for how we think about those things.
Thank you, James. I think knowing patience, it came from a place of researchers and implementing agencies trying to access data from different countries and from other institutions that have carried out research in the same similar aquifers, and always finding walls and fences building up instead of doors and gates opening. So, you know, it's somewhat refreshing to know that we're not the only ones facing this problem, but it's also interesting to see how you around that. And, you know, like from a person very much interested in policy, to sort of hear from you that you have to have data sharing agreement almost on a bilateral basis for pretty much any kind of data set that you want to access or information that you want to access is not so refreshing. I must say. Like that's a very long path to follow. But nonetheless, it's a good idea, and it's probably something that we should take up with. We have a regional government, well, a regional, not a government, but a regional community of the member states, which is called the Southern African Development Community here. And in theory, their task is to foster policy harmonization and, you know, working together, collaborative efforts to manage, especially cross-border natural resources, so including water. So maybe it's more of a role that they take, and we need to push for that to happen, as opposed to trying to always go a bilateral way. Since we have that institution, may as well start to use it.
Yeah, that does sound like an excellent idea, and that's certainly our experience. If you want, I can sort of talk about the Colorado River Delta, which seems to have some parallels with what you're mentioning.
Yeah, please carry on with your presentation. I don't see any other questions or raised hands. Thank you. Thank you, James.
Sure. So I will talk fairly briefly about this. but you know, you can discuss more if you have questions. But the Colorado River Delta, just to show you, so the U.S. Is here. This is California. Hopefully you can see my cursor. This is also the U.S. on this side. This is Arizona. And then on this side is the state of Baja California. And on this side of so the river actually forms the border between the two countries here, and continues down to the Gulf of California, which you can see here in the inset. And so this is the state of Sonora on this side of the river. So this area is incredibly important to both countries in terms of agriculture. It's kind of the breadbasket, one of the breadbaskets for Mexico, and the source of winter vegetables for much of the U.S. and likely Canada. I'm not particularly aware of that, but it wouldn't surprise me. So, so water is really important here. Water is diverted from the river into irrigation canals. So that has ecological implications. There's no longer amounts of fresh water entering the upper Gulf, so that's a part of what people are studying. So this is this work is also governed by one of those minutes, a modification to the Water Treaty of 1944, and we have probably 15 organizations that are working together, both at the state, federal level. There are universities involved, there are NGOs involved. And our budget for the work is about, there's additional money coming in, but the laid out budget between the two countries is $1 million a year for this project. And so we have restoration of the main particular part of the minute is to restore riparian habitat along the river and to in some way try to restore some flows. I don't want to go into this in too great a detail, but suffice it to say that return flow, so groundwater, is a critical piece of the equation. So how do groundwater and surface water interact here? There are issues of salinity, and then how does all of that affect important ecosystem variables such as vegetation health, bird health, etc. So I bring this up because it's such a complex study project, and I wasn't sure if you guys might have some things where you're also thinking about the ecological component of what's going on with those groundwater surface water interactions. It's also really a good example in terms of governance. How do we work together? It's a pretty involved process. It's very incremental, but we do make progress. And I'll talk about some of the reasons for that success. We're also looking at trying to understand indicators. So we're trying to improve things. So what are indicators of improvements? Could they be rising water levels? Is it improved vegetation health, more birds? And then we also want to manage adaptively because we know we don't know everything about the system. We don't know how climate will affect that. We also, there are things like earthquakes that happen in this area that can damage infrastructure and have damaged infrastructure that can really alter the way water is used in the area. And then I've talked a fair amount about data management, and I'll mention more of that later. So in the next piece, let me just look at the time here. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Because we've talked a lot about it already, but looking at some of the lessons learned from the assessment of these two aquifers in particular. So we were able to establish binational technical teams along the border initially. But our team in the Sonora, Arizona area was the only one that actually survived through 2016 when the process to reinitiate work in Texas and New Mexico was begun. So why was this? So one of the critical things that we did, and this is based on a paper that we published last year, is that some of the folks on our team are social scientists. They have expertise in economics and governance and legal frameworks. And that was critical to helping us succeed. So very few hydrologists are trained in any of these areas. And as I mentioned, we have different legal frameworks, languages, et cetera. In terms of understanding it, we went the project in two phases. So what we call laying the groundwork and implementation. I'm not going to go into all these details. If you're interested, I can share the link to the article with you. So in our laying the groundwork phase, we develop an understanding of the context. So what's the physical context? Geology, climate, land cover, soils, hydrology. What's the economic context, which we've talked about a little bit already. What's the legal context? Mix of federal and state regulation. Mexican water law is largely federal. What are the treaties? Understanding those. What's the socio-political context? Income, immigration, internal politics, and pressures. So even though we may not as we work together, that there might be pressures when we're in the room with our colleagues from Mexico, and that by asking them questions, we can help to improve our understanding of what challenges they're facing or what is going into their decision making. So we have institutional, we need to understand institutions. So different jurisdiction, authority, some are research focused like the USGS, different cultures. This is critical: perceptions, values, language. How do we operate together? How do we do people from different cultures sit down in the same way and talk to each other in the same way? How do you run a meeting? So what is the history? The evolution of law, cooperation, war. There has been war between the two countries. Trade, culture, economics. It's the biological system. I'll just give you a little bit more information about this particular aquifer. Fairly small population, but a big piece of this is that it's really critical area for conservation, especially of birds. We have military installation there. There's U.S. on the U.S. side, mandated maintenance of sustainable yields. And then we have this huge copper deposit on the Mexican side, which is estimated to be in the one of the top 5 largest in the world, and is 40% of Mexico's annual copper production. In the Santa Cruz Aquifer, which is just to the west, excuse me, the river begins in the U.S. But it's a major economic and industrial corridor. With estimates between $10 and $20 billion annual in US dollars. Also intensive mining area, the source of contamination. And then we have some complexities because of state management of water. So Arizona water law inadvertently encourages maximal, in Arizona specifically, very also in the phase one, we need to talk about engagement. So how do local communities talk to one another? Can we talk across the border? We have to work on that. So it's critical to do that, to build relationships, the shared history and trust. So how do we come together to befriend one another across the border? That is critical to working well together. So we have done this with a long series of binational meetings with stakeholders and other key actors. The University of Sonora. You see here, I've launched into putting some Spanish just to show you when we work together. Most of our, in fact, all of our work is we try to keep bilingual. Sometimes they're all in Spanish, sometimes they're all in English. It just depends on who's present and their comfort level. We have the USGS on the US side, universities, and then there are additional participants on both sides. As mentioned, the BD&TbWC, International Boundary and Water Commission on both sides. This photograph that you've seen a couple of times commemorates the signing of our joint report, so the agreement that allows us to proceed with this assessment. And as I mentioned before, there are these 4 focus aquifers. We have various products that we use to communicate sheets. We've carried out the detail about another time. We've developed binational data sets, binational line cover, binational geology. Sometimes we couldn't. Binational soils, we use 2 very different systems of classification of soils, and that will have to be in future work. Because we're running short on time, I'm going to skip through some of this. We have various publications. We're working on our binational reports, bilingual reports. We have come up with this framework for what are the elements necessary to help with success in doing this binational work. So we've already talked pretty much about most of these. Let's see. So some of our challenges. So as I mentioned earlier, misunderstanding the correct channels to work through, not being aware of the correct protocols. Words matter, different interpretations of words. So even that, different interpretations of the word Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program, which is the name of our project, was interpreted differently on both sides of the border, and unfortunately led to a cancellation of work for several years in the Texas and New Mexico area, just because of the different understanding of those words on both sides. So cultural and socio-political sensitivity is important, and I'm going to just kind of move through these because I want to have time for questions. I can talk more about that depending on what people's interests are. We have very specific ways of thinking about research methods, data, and publication, and negotiating. How do we do that? Has been a long and very interesting process. So what are our solutions? Thinking about social scientists or science, I call it adaptation, accommodation, and perseverance. So blending political and social science with institutional asymmetries, different funding cycles, shifting institutional priorities, and personnel changes. So I have talked a little bit about this, and I think I'm just going to end there. So if there is time for questions about any of this, we can have a moment.
Thank you very much, James. This is really fascinating to hear somebody else's experience from a totally different continent and border. Thank you so much for your time today. I see that there is a question from Thomas Murphy. I'm gonna unmute you, Thomas, so you can ask your question directly. So just give me a second. Where is Thomas here? There you go. Thomas, can you talk?
Hi, can you hear me?
Thomas? Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you fine. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, question is your, yes, aquifer data collection methodology. Are you guys using seismic methods or any
Thomas,
newer methods like? I'm sorry?
Thomas, there's a lot of disturbance. We can't hear you. Okay, let me read the question then that he wrote. There's a lot of disturbance. So he asked if you are using seismic measurements or quantum geoelectrophysics methods for aquifer studies.
So the answer is yes. So it, of course, depends on the nature of the particular aquifer and the data needs. But I would say most of the aquifer studies have involved geophysical methods, everything from seismic to electromagnetic and electrical methods, gravity, magnetism, so the whole suite. I'm trying to think if anyone has done much with borehole geophysical methods for this particular project. One of the things that we benefit from on the US side is that there has been in some locations, extensive work done prior to the project. So we do have some boreholes with geophysical logs from previous work. But for the current phase, yes, we've done specifically a fair amount of electrical and electromagnetic work. So time domain, frequency domain, gravity work, and magnetic work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there this last part of the presentation or even on what happened, on what was discussed before? I'm really interested and fascinated because I think that's one of the things that we struggle a lot here in terms of dealing with natural resource projects, whether it is water or other, natural resources. It's to really put together these teams of people with different expertise. So we tend to think that just because there is, the critical element is water or the critical element is wildlife, that is what the team of expertise, that's what they need to be composed of. Whereas clearly, especially when you're dealing with transboundary issues, there's a lot more to it than meet the eye. And like you say, the context is really important. You need to understand what is the legal environment in which you operate before you even begin to do anything else. So before you even learn languages and other things. And that's something that is often a bit of an oversight, but we're working with some of the colleagues in this particular project from Delta H on, making sure that there is a real legal contextualization of what is being researched on and how we foresee the future of this exercise in providing big data tools for the remote aquifer in Southern Africa. So for me, this was very interesting to see that you have also come to the same conclusions. And I really, really like this adaptation, accommodation, and perseverance. I think I'm going to steal it, quoting you, of course. But I really, really, really like it. I think it really speaks very much to any work that anybody tries to do in transboundary context. You need to be flexible. You need to make accommodations, even on things that sometimes you have identified as priorities, but now you find yourself that they're no longer priorities, or you have to accommodate on perceptions. And perseverance, of course, because if you give up, everything is gone. And then you not only you forget the past, but you also don't provide the future or for good management. So there are no more questions and no raised hands. I really would like to thank you for having rescheduled this, for having given us an hour of your time. If there are any questions that come from our audience or from our teams in the future, I will direct to our aquifer between South Africa and Botswana. Please remark or directly via me, stay in touch.
Thank you. I would love to hear more about what you guys are working on, and I would be happy to entertain any questions. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, James. This is Mark. Real quick, I also want to express my appreciation. I think you did a fantastic job of sharing, those lessons learned we talked about with regards to the complexity of not only the resource, but the complexity of the cultures and language and all those barriers. But I'll have another question for you to follow up. You don't have to answer it now, but I was just curious real quickly on the geophysics. How did you decide? Obviously you can't, unless you're doing airborne or something, you can't do geophysics over the whole aquifer. Did you decide, to get some physical dimensions or information on some, target areas, or how did you decide that?
Yeah, it just on the particular question, most of the time we didn't have sufficient financial resources to do the whole area. So
right.
We would specifically target certain areas. So for instance, on the Mexican side, they use transient electromagnetics because they were trying to get additional information on geologic structure. Other places used more local methods to understand smaller structures like faults and things like that. Good.
Well, I don't want to extend the people online unless there's stimulated other questions. But anyway, I just wanted to thank you personally.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, everybody, enjoy the rest of your day in the US. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening in Africa and wherever you may be. I don't know actually everybody who attended. Some names are new to me, but I'm hoping to get them later. For people in the audience, we'll see you again next week for the second to last webinar from the USGS. Thank you, everybody.
Adios.
Thank you.
Adios.